The frost had come early to the high country that October. He could see his breath in the pale morning air. Small white clouds pulled apart by the same wind that had stripped the aspens bare. The ridge above him, broad and granite-shouldered, catching the first light, looked exactly as it always had. Indifferent, patient, old in a way that made a man feel the brevity of his own particular days. He set his pack against a boulder at the trail's edge and stood looking up at it for a long moment without moving. 46 years old. The knees told him so every morning now, and the gray in his beard, and the way cold mornings required longer before the hands opened all the way. He reached into the top flap of his pack and touched the brim of a hat. Flat-crowned, brown wool, the sweat stain along the band gone stiff as leather. He did not take it out, not yet, just touched it, the way you touch a thing you are not ready to look at directly. He turned back to the ridge and began to talk. Not to anyone on the trail. There was no one on the trail. The nearest man was 11 miles northeast in Granite, and the nearest after that was Salida, another hour's ride beyond. He talked the way a man talks when he has been carrying something long enough that the weight of it has become indistinguishable from his own weight, and the only remedy is to set it down in words and let the country hear it. The first time we came up this way, he said, it was June, 11th of June, 1867, a Tuesday. He paused. The wind moved through the dry grass on the lower slope. They had come into Granite off the Arkansas River Trail on the 9th, a Saturday, warm and bright, the kind of Colorado morning that makes a man briefly forget that the mountains have killed more than they have given. The two of them had been 3 months out of Pueblo, 3 months since they had stood in a churchyard in the brown March cold and pushed dirt into a hole above their father, and then looked at each other across that hole the way you look at a person when you suddenly understand that they are the whole of what remains. Thomas Calloway had died on a Thursday, the 11th of March, a lung sickness that had started in January and finished what it started with a kind of grim efficiency. He was 41 years old. He left them a Henry rifle, a hand axe, 2 bedrolls, and $3.10 in coin, the sum total of a life lived in honest, exhausting work on the wrong side of luck. They had pointed themselves north and west because there was nothing south or east that asked them to come. And they had walked until they found this valley and what was waiting in it. The trading post at Granite sat 12 feet from the riverbank, close enough that the Arkansas could be heard through the plank walls on a quiet afternoon, a low, cold muttering that never entirely stopped. We pushed through the door on the afternoon of the 9th, a Saturday, blinking in the dim interior after the bright trail, barrels of salt pork, coils of rope, shelves of tinned goods, arranged with the particular pride of a man who has very little to arrange. The smell of coal oil and dried beans and something underneath it all, faintly sweet, that I eventually placed as sawdust from a recent repair to the floor. The man behind the counter was perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, with a clerk's habit of looking at what you were wearing before he looked at your face. He had a mustache that wanted to be impressive and wasn't. His left hand rested on the counter, and the tip of his index finger was gone from the first knuckle, the skin there smooth and old-healed, the kind of wound a man stops explaining. We asked about the land southwest of town, whether anyone had claimed it, whether there was anything worth going up for, past the ridge they called the shoulder. He looked at us the way a man looks at a puddle he is deciding whether to step around. The shoulder, he said. And he said it the way you say the name of a thing that has wasted other people's time before yours. Hides nothing but rock and regret. Prospector's been up there. 2 or 3 outfits tried to winter in that drainage 10 years back. Nothing came of it. There's no silver in that granite, and nothing to farm above 9,000 feet that won't freeze in July. He turned back to his ledger. If you're looking for work, there's a freighting operation out of Buena Vista, hiring mule handlers. That was the sum of it. He didn't ask our names. I was turning to leave when I felt the quality of the silence change behind me, the way a room shifts when someone else is paying attention to it. There was a woman at the far end of the counter. She had come through a curtained doorway without any sound at all, and she was watching me with the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something said in a way she disagrees with, but has learned not to correct out loud. She was perhaps 40, or perhaps older, with dark eyes and a capable steadiness in the way she held herself. She didn't speak. She only looked at me for a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then she looked away and began moving a stack of folded cloth from one part of the counter to another, slowly, like a woman with a great deal of time. I didn't know what she'd meant by it, but I didn't forget it either. We spent our last 60 cents on 4 days' worth of hardtack, stepped back into the afternoon sun, and started up the trail. The trail out of granite was good for the first mile. Packed dirt, mule-rutted, the kind of path that lets a man think the day will be reasonable. Then it quit. Not gradually, the way most trails thin out as the settlements fall behind, but abruptly, as if whoever had made it simply stopped caring right at the edge of a particular stand of spruce and walked back home. We crossed into the trees on our own judgment and started climbing. The packs sat at roughly 40 pounds each. Eli had adjusted without comment, shifting the rifle to his right shoulder and taking Cass's extra tin and the shared salt pork in addition to his own share, so that Cass carried mostly the tent canvas, his bedroll, and the axe. Cass never asked him to. He'd have refused if asked. But Eli understood that Cass climbed better when he wasn't spent, and that Cass climbing better was worth the weight in Eli's shoulders. The lower slope came up through pine, thick, close-ranked, the ground underneath carpeted in brown needles that gave a little with each step the way deep carpet does. Absorbing sound, the light came in at angles, cutting across the trunks in pale bars. Cass stopped every quarter mile or so, pulled the leather journal from his coat, and sketched. Not the view, there wasn't one yet through the trees, but particulars, the grain of a particular boulder, the way a dead pine had fallen across a living one, and both had kept growing, the fallen one at a 30-degree angle, still putting out needles. The shape of a piece of feldspar he found in the creek bed they crossed around mid-morning, which he pocketed, and then, 200 yards later, set back down again, because the weight wasn't worth the sentiment. The altitude started biting above the tree line, the pines thinned, then stopped altogether, and the world opened into scree and low granite outcroppings, and a sky so blue it looked painted. The air had the quality of something thinner than it should be, not thin enough to stop you, but thin enough to remind you with each breath that the mountain was in charge of the arrangement. Eli's lungs adjusted slowly. His pulse climbed and stayed there. They didn't speak much on ascent, a few words when necessary. "Watch that loose stone. There's a line 20 feet left. Water at that depression." But mostly silence that wasn't uncomfortable. They had been climbing together since they were boys in Missouri, since their father took them up the limestone bluffs above the river on Sunday mornings. Before the war changed everything. Before the lung sickness took him in a Pueblo boarding house on a gray afternoon in March. Silence on a slope meant they were all right. It was the talking that meant something was wrong. They camped that Monday night on the upper ridge of the shoulder, where a ledge of granite offered enough flat ground for the canvas and not much else. The fire was small. Below them was only dark. The fire went out sometime before midnight. Neither of them woke to rebuild it. When Eli opened his eyes, the sky above the granite ledge was still fully dark, stars hard and closed the way they only get above 8,000 feet, and the cold had pressed itself flat against every surface. The canvas, the wool, the stone. He lay still for a while, listening to his brother's breathing, and the occasional tick of rock contracting in the chill. There was no wind. The mountain was perfectly quiet, in the way that mountains are quiet when they are not actively trying to kill you, patient, indifferent, tolerant of your small fire, and your small sleep. He did not check his watch. He let the dark run out on its own. By the time pale gray began separating the eastern horizon from the sky, he had hardtack and the last of their salt pork heating in the pan on a rebuilt fire. His brothers slept until the smell of it reached him, which was not long. They ate without much conversation, the tin cups warming their hands, breath visible, the light strengthening slowly the way it does at altitude. Cautious at first, then suddenly committed. It was his brother who stood first. He had been crouching at the eastern lip of the ridge, looking down into whatever lay on the other side. And for a moment he said nothing at all. He was 17, and lean from the trail, and still growing into his hands and feet, and he stood there at the edge, with the light breaking across his shoulders, and Eli watched him from across the fire, not yet understanding what he was seeing. Then his brother turned around, and he laughed. Not a small laugh, not the quiet exhale that passes for amusement between two people who've been together too long. A real laugh, sudden and full, and surprised out of him, like something he hadn't planned. The kind that belongs to a boy who has just been handed evidence that the world is stranger and more generous than he was told. Eli could count on one hand the times he had heard that laugh, and he stood up from the fire without thinking. He crossed to the lip of the ridge and looked down. Below them, cupped between the granite shoulders of the shoulder itself, lay a valley. Not a suggestion of one, a full valley, maybe a quarter-mile across, threaded through its center by a creek that caught the early light in bright, broken pieces. The meadow grass was high and blue-green in the morning mist. There was a barn, or the skeleton of one, gray timber collapsed on its eastern side but still standing on the west, its roofline sagging like a question. And below the barn, the low dark lines of stone walls, a cabin, or what had been one, half returned to the hillside. Someone had been here. Someone had tried to stay. We went down without eating. The younger one was already moving before I had kicked the fire apart, his pack half buckled, that particular forward lean he got when something had him. I followed without a word. We picked our way off the upper ridge along a seam of shale that angled southwest, the granite slick with morning damp, and it took us the better part of an hour to reach the valley floor. By the time our boots hit meadow grass, the mist had thinned to almost nothing, and the sun was clearing the eastern shoulder, throwing long gold light across the creek and the high blue-green timothy that came up past our knees. The grass was wrong for abandoned country. Too tall, too full. It had been growing undisturbed for years, maybe a decade, and it had taken the meadow back completely. The creek ran fast and clear along the northern edge, maybe 12 feet across, and cold enough that when I knelt and put my hand in the current, I could feel it in my back teeth. We crossed toward the barn first. Up close, it was worse than it looked from the ridge. The eastern wall had come down entirely, the roof had followed it, and the collapsed timber had partially buried what might have been a small lean-to on that side. But the north wall held solid notched pine logs, gray as ash, chinked with dried mud that had mostly stayed put. Someone had built this to last, and it had lasted despite everything except time. Past the barn and lower on the slope, maybe 40 yards. The cabin. The roof was entirely gone, caved inward, but the walls stood chest high, and the hearth was intact. A deep stone fireplace at the cabin's western end, built from Flat Creek granite stacked with real care, the kind of care a man puts into something he plans to use for a long time. The firebox was wide and square, and the lintel stone was a single piece, 6 feet long. Someone had manhandled that stone into place. Someone with a plan. I was standing in the doorless doorway, measuring the walls with my eyes, when my brother made a small sound, not a word, something quieter, and I turned. He was crouched at the hearth with his thumb tracing something in the face of the lintel stone. Letters, cut into the granite with something narrow, a chisel or the point of a good knife. He traced them again, slowly, making sure. A. Pepper, 1861. 6 years. The name had been here 6 years, and before that, the man who cut it had been here, and then he had not. There was a rusted frame of bent iron and rotted timber down near the creek's edge, the shape of a sluice box, narrow and low, tipped on its side and half overgrown. Whoever Pepper was, he had tried everything this valley could offer. He had tried to stay. The question of why he hadn't was still sitting in the air between us. Cass had always been the one who noticed things the rest of the world stepped over. I have thought about that many times since, how a man can look at a patch of ground and see ground, and another man looks at the same patch and sees that something is wrong with it. The stones were at the northeast corner of the collapsed barn, where 2 rotted wall logs had fallen outward and left a gap you could step through without ducking. He would have been poking along the base of the remaining wall, the way he did, trailing a hand along the timber, turning over whatever the grass had swallowed. I heard nothing. Then he said my name, just once, in a tone I had learned to pay attention to. The cairn was low, no taller than a man's fist stacked twice, but it was deliberate. 7 flat stones, each one chosen for its flatness, set in a neat pile on a patch of ground that had been cleared of grass before the grass had grown back around it. Not a grave marker. Too small, too careful, too much like a thing that wanted to be found by the right person and missed by everyone else. We looked at it together for a moment without touching it. It took less than 3 minutes to lift the stones one by one and set them aside. He worked and I watched the tree line out of habit. Beneath the last stone, the earth was darker, still holding a little moisture that the stones had kept from evaporating over however many seasons. He reached in with both hands and brought it up. A tin box, flat and rectangular, roughly 8 inches long, 5 wide, no thicker than a man's thumb doubled. The lid was sealed all the way around with candle wax that had gone the color of old bone, mottled and faintly yellow, with a single long crack in it that hadn't broken the seal. He passed it to me. It weighed almost nothing. That was the first thing. I had expected weight from something buried that carefully, and there was none. Just the cool of the metal and the slight flex of the lid under my thumb when I tested it. And then I stopped testing it. Whatever was inside had been sealed in there by someone with a reason. We did not open it at the cairn. I am not sure which of us decided that. It was one of those decisions that arrived between us without words. He gathered the stones back into a loose pile, some old instinct for tidying what you'd disturbed. I carried the box. Inside the cabin, I laid it on the hearthstone while he gathered tinder and the dry ends of fallen timber from around the barn's edge. The firebox drew clean. Whoever had built that chimney had known what he was doing. We waited until the fire was settled and throwing good heat before we sat down together and looked at what we had. The lid came off with one firm press of my thumb at the corner. The wax had cracked in a thin line along the front edge, but it had held. 24 years in the ground, and it had held. Inside, folded once across the middle, was a sheet of paper so dry it crinkled at the edges when I opened it, as though it had forgotten what it meant to be touched. My brother leaned in close enough that I could feel the heat of his shoulder against mine. The firelight moved on the page. It was a land deed, 140 acres, described by metes and bounds in careful copperplate. The northeast corner marked by a granite outcrop, the southern boundary following a seasonal creek, the western line running upslope to the ridge. Dated the 14th of April, 1861. Signed in a hand that was precise and slightly cramped, the letters leaning forward as though the man had been in a hurry. Aldous Pepper. And beneath it, the witness line. 2 words in a different hand, rounder and more settled. Renata Scholl. I read the name twice. Then I set the deed carefully on the hearthstone and looked into the fire for a moment without speaking. She had known. She had stood behind that trading post counter and listened to us ask about the shoulder, and watched Orson Duddy tell us it hid nothing, and she had not said a word. She had looked at us with that expression I could not name, not quite pity, not quite hope, something that lived in the space between them, and she had let us walk out the door. She had witnessed this deed with her own hand. She had known what was on this hill, or at least that something was, and she had chosen not to give it to us. She had chosen to let us find it ourselves. I didn't know yet whether to feel grateful for that or something less comfortable. The second thing in the box was a survey, hand-drawn, ink on heavier stock, the lines ruled with something straight and sure. This valley, the creek, the barn's location marked with a small square, the cairn itself noted in the northeast corner, with a single X, and the annotation, deed box here, in letters so small, I had to tilt the page toward the flame to read them. He had known he was going to bury it. He had planned it carefully enough to note it on the survey. The third thing was a tintype, small enough to fit in a shirt pocket, slightly bent at one corner. A man, angular face, heavy beard, the look of someone who did not smile easily, standing beside a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years. The girl had her hand around 2 of the man's fingers. She was not smiling either, but something in how she held on made smiling beside the point. My brother took the tintype and held it close to the fire without saying anything. We stayed 3 days. I had not planned it that way. We had 6 days of salt pork and hardtack between us. The sky was holding clear, and there was no reason written anywhere that said we had to leave. So we didn't. The first morning I pulled enough of the barn's north wall upright to lean the canvas half against it and get us out of the dew. The wall was Douglas fir. The boards dried past any rot that mattered, and it held when I braced it with 2 lengths of deadfall from the tree line. My brother notched them with the hand axe while I held the wall. I could feel the vibration of each strike travel up through the wood and into my palms. By mid-morning, we had something that was not quite shelter and was not quite nothing, which is the best a man can ask for when he's working with what the land provides. He spent the afternoon with the survey. He walked the creek first, north to south, pacing it in his careful, slightly loping stride. I watched him from the wall, counting steps I couldn't hear. Then he turned east and walked the meadow's edge, stopping to look back at the barn, back at the creek, back at the shape of the ridge above us. He was matching what his feet told him to what the hand-drawn lines said, and every time they agreed, I could see it in how he held his shoulders. At supper, he told me, 140 acres, roughly. The creek runs through the northwest quarter. The meadow's good, maybe 60 acres of it, maybe more, if you clear the scrub along the south edge. The soil where the kitchen garden had been was dark, almost black, even after 4 years of no one working it. We talked that night in a way we hadn't talked in a long time. Not about what we'd found, not the deed, not the tintype, but about the land itself, about what it would mean to file, to build, to put up a real wall, a real roof, a floor that didn't give. He said it the way he always said the hard things, quietly, looking at the fire rather than at me. We could stop, Eli. We could stop here. I turned the words over the way you turn a coin, feeling for the weight of them. The second day I mapped the creek myself. Depth at 8 points, current, where it slowed into the wide pool the trout held in. The third morning we sat on the low granite shelf above the barn and watched the meadow come into the light, the grass moving in a wind we couldn't feel from up there, silver and then green as the angle changed. "He had the tintype in his breast pocket!" I knew because every so often he put his hand there, briefly, the way you check a thing you're not ready to set down. On the 4th morning I left Cass on the shelf with the survey and the tin cup and walked back down to Granite alone. The trail took me 3 hours. I came into the settlement from the north side, past the pole corral where 2 mules stood in the heat, and went straight to the trading post. Not to Duddy. I had no interest in Duddy. I went to the woman I'd seen the first day. The one behind the dry goods counter with the careful hands. Renata Scholl. She was alone when I came in. She looked at me the way people look at someone they expected but didn't know they were expecting. I set the deed on the counter between us without saying anything, and she looked at it for a long moment without touching it. Then she said, "You found the cairn." I said we had. She pulled a stool from behind the counter and sat down on it, which told me the telling was going to take some time. Aldous Pepper had come into the valley in the spring of 1861, she said. Broke. Genuinely broke. Not trail broke, but coin broke. Nothing in his pockets but a survey he'd drawn himself, and a stubbornness she described without contempt as the purest kind of stubbornness, the kind that comes from having nothing left to protect except an idea. He'd built the farm over 2 summers without help. The barn first, then the cabin. He'd carried every timber by hand up from the lower pine line, because he didn't have a horse. In September of 1862, he came to her with the deed and asked her to witness it. She signed. She noted the date in the Post's ledger, September 14th, 1862. That December he left for Granite on foot to get medicine. His daughter May was sick. Not badly, she thought, not life-threatening, but he wasn't a man who waited to see. He never arrived. They found him on the trail in January, frozen, face down, 3 miles short of the settlement. He was 41 years old. May had already been sent east before the cold came, to a sister in Ohio, a woman named Schreiber in a town called Findlay. Renata had arranged it herself. She did not know what had become of the girl. I asked her about the cairn, why she'd said nothing all these years. She folded her hands on the counter. "Because men who go looking for things they're owed come empty," she said. "Men who go looking out of honest curiosity sometimes find what was left for them." I picked the deed up and put it back in my shirt. I walked the 11 miles back up the valley in the afternoon, and I had a lot of time to think. By the time I came through the tree line and saw the tent half-glowing pale orange in the last light, I had turned the whole thing over enough times that I knew what shape it was. I just didn't know what to do with the shape. Cass had a fire going. He looked at my face and didn't ask anything until I'd sat down and eaten half my salt pork. Then he just waited. I told him everything. Aldous Pepper. The deed. The girl named May, sent east to a town called Findlay, Ohio, to a woman named Schreiber. The way Renata had folded her hands when she said what she said about men who go looking. Cass listened without interrupting, which wasn't like him. When I finished, he sat for a long time, poking at the fire with a green stick, watching the sparks climb. "The land's deeded to a dead man," he finally said. "Yes. But the daughter might be living." "Might be." He turned the stick over. "Then it's hers." I didn't argue with that, but I laid out the problem plainly. We had $3.10 between us. Ohio was roughly 1,000 miles east. We didn't have a horse. We barely had 6 days of food. He knew all that. He sat with it anyway, the way Cass sat with hard things, not impatient, not rushing toward a solution, just letting the difficulty be the size it was. What followed was not a fight, exactly. It was more like 2 men in a small boat who disagree about which way to row, but neither one is willing to let go of the oar. We went back and forth for the better part of the evening. He thought we should carry the tin box down to Granite and hand it to Renata for safekeeping. I thought Renata had already held that secret for 4 years and chosen not to act on it. Leaving it with her felt like setting it down in the same place it had been. What we finally agreed on surprised us both a little by how simple it was. We would put it back. We'd rebury the tin box under the cairn exactly as we'd found it, mark the position in Cass's journal with enough detail that we could find it again in the dark if we needed to. And we would make a promise, not a vague one, not a someday, that we would come back when we had the means to do this right. Find May Pepper if she was alive to be found. Do it properly. Cass wrote it into the journal that night by firelight, his handwriting small and careful. That was the last night we spent in the valley. We reburied the tin box the following morning, reset the cairn stone by stone, and walked out the way we'd come in. I am not going to pretend the 24 years between that morning and this October were moving towards something. They weren't. We drifted. That was the truth of it. South into New Mexico territory one winter, back up through Utah the spring after. We talked about Ohio the way men talk about the town they grew up in, with a kind of fond, distant intention that never quite sharpens into a plan. We never found May Pepper. We never had the means we told ourselves we needed. The years had a way of spending themselves without asking permission. My brother died in Durango in the autumn of 1887. Typhoid fever, a rooming house on a side street I couldn't find again if I tried. He was 41 years old. I sat with him 3 days, and then he was gone, and I walked out into the street holding his old brown hat in my hands, because someone had to hold it. I've carried it in my pack ever since, 4 years now. I found his journal in his gear. He'd kept it the whole time, added to it in his cramped, careful hand, trails, camps, the price of things, small observations about weather and country. Near the back, between 2 pages that had been folded together and stuck with age, was the Valley Survey. Aldous Pepper's hand-drawn lines, the creek, the ridge, the corner where the cairn sat, and underneath it, in my brother's writing, the note he'd made that night by firelight in June of 1867. Northeast corner, collapsed barn, 7 flat stones, count 3 feet west of the lowest. I came up from Salida on a hired mule in the second week of October. The aspen had already gone. The grass on the high slopes was tawny and flat, and the cold came down early in the afternoons, the way it always does at this elevation. 11 miles from the trailhead. I remembered more of it than I expected. The cairn was still there. 24 years of snowpack and melt and frost heave, and those 7 flat stones had barely shifted. I set them aside one at a time and dug with the hand axe into the rocky soil, and at roughly 14 inches I felt the corner of it. The tin box, dull and dark with oxidation, smaller than I remembered. The wax seal had cracked, gone brittle as old bark. But when I pried the lid, the contents were dry. The deed, the survey, the tintype of a man and a girl, their faces still clear. I rode back down to Salida, with the box wrapped in my bedroll, and I laid the deed and the survey on the counter at the Chaffee County Recorder's Office on the morning of October 14th, 1891. The clerk was a young man with ink on his fingers, who looked at me the way young men look at someone who has been outside too long. I told him what I wanted. He said he would need to see proof of the locating party. I told him the locating party was 2 brothers, one living, one not, summer of 1867, and that the rightful claim traced back further still, to a homesteader who died on the trail to Granite in the winter of 1863, and to his daughter, May, last known to be in Ohio. He wrote it down, all of it. He filed the deed under both names, as I asked, and noted in the record that the land was to be held in recognition of the original holder's estate, daughter surviving. Whether May was still living I did not know, but her name was in the county record now, beside ours, which was more than she'd had that morning. I rode back up the same afternoon. At the farm I found the one section of fence still standing, cedar rail, gray and dry, solid enough. I cut a length of it with the hand axe and drove it into the slope at the edge of what had once been the near field, 10 feet uphill from the cairn I'd restacked with its 7 stones. It took a while. The ground was cold and stony, and October does not forgive slow work. But it went in true, and when I stood back, it stood straight against the mountain. I took the hat from my pack, flat-crowned brown wool, sweat-stained around the band in a shape that was his, and nobody else's. I had carried it 4 years. I set it on the post. The wind came down off the shoulder, and the hat shifted once and settled. I stood there a while. Then I walked back down. Here is what I know, after all of it. A promise made to someone who can no longer remind you of it is the truest kind, because the only reason left to keep it is that you said you would. He can't call it in. He can't thank you. There is nothing coming back. You keep it because you were the kind of men who made it, and because somewhere in you, you still are. If you've got someone like that, someone you'd climb a dismissed hill for, you already know what I mean. If you've found this channel, you're welcome here. Leave a word below. We'd like to know who's listening.